The air in Ethelberg, the city of order, did not smell of spices or life. It carried the sterile, metallic tang of recycled oxygen and the faint ozonic perfume of the omnipresent energy grid that powered its monolithic spires. This was the year of the Grand Unification, the centennial celebration of the city's founding, and its sterile arteries pulsed not with joyous pilgrims, but with citizens moving in synchronized, almost hypnotic patterns. Their movements were a testament to the city's ruling philosophy, dictated by the Synod of Elders. Order is peace. Unity is strength. Individuality is chaos. Towering chrome structures pierced the perpetually overcast sky, reflecting a uniform grey light that bathed the city in a muted, somber glow. On every corner, holographic banners shimmered with the face of High Elder Theron, his expression a mask of serene authority, his words reinforcing the collective will. For weeks, the city had been preparing for the festival, a grand display of conformity designed to purge any lingering whispers of dissent. But a different kind of current had been surging beneath the city's placid surface, an energy that was wild, unpredictable, and deeply human. It had begun with the arrival of one man, Jesus. He had not entered through the grand archway with a procession, but had emerged from the forgotten underlevels, the outlands, where the city's refuse and its forgotten people were relegated. He walked with a quiet confidence that was in itself an act of rebellion in a city that demanded synchronized marching steps. He spoke not of dogma or regulations, but of a radical, terrifying concept. A love that was unconditional, a spirit that was free, and a kingdom not built of steel and logic, but residing within the heart of each person. His words were like rain on parched earth. In the sterile plazas where citizens were meant to perform their civic meditations in silence, small crowds began to gather. At first they were hesitant, drawn by a curiosity they couldn't name. Then the whispers grew into a murmur, and the murmur into a song. A week before the festival, a crowd of thousands had gathered in the central nexus, not waving palm branches, but holding up their own open, empty hands, a symbol of their yearning. They had cried out his name, not as a king, but as a liberator. Their voices a chaotic, beautiful symphony that shattered the city's orchestrated silence. This was a virus the Synod could not tolerate. High Elder Theron, his face contorted in a private fury behind his public mask of calm, saw Jesus not as a holy man, but as a fundamental threat to the very architecture of their society. The established order, built on control and fear, could not withstand a message of absolute love. The Synod, the supreme ideological court of Ethelberg, moved swiftly. They manipulated data streams, broadcasted altered recordings of his words, and stoked the deep-seated fear of chaos that had been programmed into the populace since birth. The same people who had seen a glimmer of hope in his eyes now saw a threat, a disruption to the fragile peace they had been taught to cherish above all else. Prefect Valerius, the Roman-descended chief of the city's wardens, a man whose lineage was steeped in the pragmatic application of power, had overseen the arrest. He had interrogated Jesus in the cold, white light of the Praetorium and had found no evidence of sedition, no plot to overthrow the state. He found only a quiet, unshakable certainty that baffled him. But the pressure from the Synod and the manufactured outrage of the populace, amplified by the city's network, was overwhelming. Valerius, a cog in the machine he commanded, washed his hands in a basin of purified water and yielded. The chosen method of execution was not the crude wooden cross of ancient times, but the pillar of penance. It was a masterpiece of cruel engineering, a public spectacle designed to serve as the ultimate deterrent. Located on the Cinder Plateau, a desolate, ash-covered expanse just beyond the city's shimmering perimeter shield, it was where ideological criminals were made an example of. The journey there, the path of atonement, was a long, cold, metallic walkway that snaked through the industrial sectors. Each step for Jesus was an agony built upon agony. The scourging had not been with leather whips, but with energy lashes that had flayed the skin from his back, cauterizing the wounds in searing black lines. The heavy, metallic beam he carried was not rough-hewn wood, but a cold, unyielding bar of alloy that bit into his raw shoulder. His every breath was a ragged gasp in the thin, polluted air of the city's edge. Now he was hoisted onto the pillar. It was a stark, T-shaped structure of obsidian metal that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Massive, superheated metallic spikes were driven through the flesh of his wrists and feet, pinning him to the cold surface. The system was designed to prolong life and therefore suffering for as long as possible. The pain was a white-hot nova, a universe of torment contained within a single broken body. Below him, a crowd had gathered. Wardens in polished black armor stood impassively. Members of the Synod, led by Theron, watched from a climate-controlled viewing platform, their faces triumphant. And the citizens, their faces a mixture of morbid fascination, fear, and programmed hatred, jeered and spat slogans. "He promised a kingdom. Look at his throne now," one screamed. "He spoke of freedom. Let him free himself," another mocked. To speak from the pillar was a monumental effort. It required the condemned to push their entire body weight up on the spikes piercing their feet, a movement that sent lightning bolts of excruciating pain through every nerve. Every word, therefore, had to be a conscious, deliberate choice, a treasure purchased at an impossible price. As the jeers reached a crescendo, as the wardens cast lots for his simple tunic, as Theron allowed himself a thin, cruel smile, Jesus strained. His muscles screamed, his vision swam in a red haze, but he pushed himself up. His chest heaved, and from his cracked, bloodied lips came not a curse, not a plea for his own innocence, but a whisper that seemed to suck the very sound out of the air. It was a sound so alien to the ethos of Ethelberg that for a moment the mocking stopped, replaced by a confused silence. "Father?" he gasped, his voice a raw rasp, yet imbued with an impossible tenderness. "Forgive them!" A stunned ripple went through the crowd. Forgive? The concept of unilateral, unearned forgiveness was anathema. Justice in Ethelberg was transactional, precise and punitive. Forgiveness was a weakness, a flaw in the system. He took another agonizing breath, his gaze sweeping over the scene, the cold-faced wardens, the smug elders, the hateful crowd, the weeping few huddled in the distance. He saw not their malice, but the profound darkness that blinded them. For they know not what they do. The words hung in the acrid air, a paradox of stunning power. This was not an excuse, but a diagnosis of a deep spiritual malady. They did not understand the nature of the love they were extinguishing, the freedom they were nailing to a metal beam, the truth they were trying to silence. Warden Cassian, the centurion in charge of the execution detail, a man whose face was a stony mask of professional detachment, felt an unwelcome shiver. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sidearm. The words were not a plea, but a declaration of a reality he suddenly, terrifyingly, felt he was on the wrong side of. In a city built on absolute knowledge and control, this man's first act in his final agony was to declare his executioners ignorant. It was the most profound rebellion of all. A love so absolute it shattered every paradigm of their world. The echo of that first impossible prayer had begun its journey, destined to crack the very foundations of Ethelberg. To the left and right of Jesus, two other pillars of penance marred the desolate landscape, each holding a man silhouetted against the bruised grey sky. They were Cale and Rorik, two souls caught in the same terminal current, yet destined for vastly different shores. Cale, a data thief and purveyor of illegal sensory experiences, was a true son of Ethelberg's cynical underbelly. He had lived by the code of self-preservation, believing in nothing but the fleeting pleasure of a successful hack or a profitable transaction. Now, facing the cold finality of the pillar, his spirit was curdled with a bitter, all-consuming rage. Rorik, however, was different. He was a revolutionary from the Outlands, a man who had once fought with righteous fire against the Synod's oppressive order. But his rebellion had devolved into violence, his ideals lost in a cascade of bombings and bloodshed. He had come to the pillar not as a martyr, but as a failure, his heart a hollowed-out crater of disillusionment. Initially, both had joined the chorus of mockery. It was the only defense they had left against the encroaching terror of their own dissolution. But Jesus' first words, that impossible plea for forgiveness, had fallen on Rorik's soul like a single clean drop of rain on a field of ash. The sound of it had silenced him, forcing an introspection he had long avoided. Kyle, however, was only emboldened. He twisted his body against the spikes, a grimace of pain and defiance on his face. "Hey, preacher!" Cale's voice was a venomous rasp, amplified slightly by the pillar's integrated audio system, a cruel feature designed to broadcast the final words of the condemned. "You spoke of a kingdom of the spirit. Where is it now, huh? Lost in the static between worlds? If you are the great liberator, then show us a miracle. Overload this grid, shut down the pillars and walk away." He laughed, a dry, rattling sound that was more pain than mirth. You saved others with your empty words, they said. Save yourself now, if you can. Rorik listened, and for the first time in years felt a stirring of something other than despair. It was a flicker of shame. He turned his head, the movement an agony, and fixed his gaze on Cale. Be silent. Rorik's voice was low, but it carried a weight that Cale's taunts lacked. Have you no fear of the final silence, you who face the same judgment? Cale spat a curse. Judgment? There is no judgment, only the machine, and then nothing. We are all just data being deleted. We are not, Rorik insisted, a strange clarity cutting through his pain. Our sentence is just. We are being unmade for the chaos we wrought for, the lives we shattered, for the blood and the broken code. We earned this pillar. But this man, he looked towards Jesus and his voice softened with a dawning, incredulous awe. This man has done nothing. His only crime was offering them a peace they could not control, a freedom they could not quantify. A profound shift occurred in Rorik. The revolutionary who had tried to build a new world with violence now looked upon the man who was building a new kingdom with love, even as his own world was being brutally dismantled. All the power structures he had fought against the Synod, the Wardens, the very logic of Ethelberg paled in comparison to the power he now witnessed in this broken figure. This was not a failed prophet. This was royalty of a kind he had never conceived. With every ounce of his remaining will, Rorik turned his face towards the central pillar. The words that came from his lips were not a demand, but a whisper of faith so fragile it seemed it might break in the harsh wind. Lord, he breathed, the title feeling both alien and perfectly right on his tongue. When you enter your true domain, remember me. He did not ask for rescue. He did not ask for a place of honor. His request was the simple, humble plea of a forgotten soldier asking his true commander not to forget his name when the war was finally over. From the central pillar, Jesus moved. The effort was titanic, a testament to a will that transcended the body's agony. He pushed himself up on the searing spikes, his bloodied head lifting. He turned his gaze upon Rorik, and in his eyes, there was no condemnation, only a vast, luminous sea of grace. His voice, when it came, cut through the wind, the static, and the lingering jeers with an authority that was absolute. Truly, he said, and the word itself felt like a foundation stone being laid for a new reality. I say to you, he paused, gathering a breath that seemed to be drawn from the very heart of creation. Today you will be with me in paradise. The word paradise was a bomb of meaning in the sterile air of Ethelberg. It was a concept they had no file for. The city's elite sought a digital eternity in the data havens, a cold immortality where consciousness was uploaded into a simulated, predictable existence. But the paradise Jesus spoke of was something else entirely. It was not a place of serene, ordered perfection. In the minds of the few who heard with their hearts a weeping woman named Mary Magdalene in the crowd, a young disciple named John the Word bloomed into an image of vibrant, chaotic, breathtaking life. It was a realm of unfiltered light, where colors existed that had no name, where every song was sung in its true, uninhibited key, where every soul was known and loved completely. It was not a destination. It was a relationship. It was not an escape from suffering, but a transformation through it. It was the promise of being with him. The effect was instantaneous. A look of sublime, uncomprehending peace washed over Rorik's face. The lines of pain and decades of bitterness dissolved, replaced by the simple, beautiful astonishment of a man who had asked for a memory and been given the universe. The fight went out of him, but it was not the limpness of defeat. It was the soft release of surrender into a promise he now knew to be more real than the metal pinning him to the pillar. Cale stared, his mouth agape, his cynical mind short-circuiting. He could not process what he had just witnessed. It was illogical. It was a promise of an impossible reward for a last-minute conversion. It was a glitch in the system of cause and effect, and it infuriated him. On the viewing platform, High Elder Theron's jaw tightened. This was more dangerous than any riot. This was ideological contagion of the highest order, spreading even from the brink of death. He made a subtle hand signal to the warden captain below. Warden Cassian saw the signal. It meant to increase the energy flow to the pillars, to speed the process along, to silence this disruptive dialogue. But he hesitated. His mind, trained in logic, protocols, and the grim calculus of execution, was reeling. He had just heard a man sentenced to erasure be promised an immediate, glorious existence. He had seen a hardened killer's face transformed by a single sentence. The words, "Today, you will be with me in paradise," echoed in his mind. It was a promise that defied every law of his reality. And for the first time in his decorated career, Warden Cassian felt a tremor of doubt, a frightening whisper that suggested the man on the central pillar operated by a set of laws far older and more powerful than those of Ethelberg. In the vast, silent theater of his agony, Jesus' awareness began to contract. The jeering of the crowd faded into a dull, rhythmic roar, like a distant sea. The cold of the obsidian pillar became a part of his own flesh, the pain a constant humming frequency that threatened to overwhelm all thought. Yet through this sensory overload, his will remained a focused point of light. He was not merely enduring, he was still ministering. His gaze, heavy with blood and sweat, began to scan the sea of faces below, not the contorted masks of hatred, but the spaces in between, searching. And then he found them. Huddled near the edge of the designated viewing area, a small island in a storm of manufactured hate, stood two figures. They were a study in silent devastation. One was his mother, Miriam. She stood unnaturally still, her hands clasped before her face a pale, sculpted mask of sorrow. Ethelberg taught its citizens to suppress such raw emotion, to process grief through sanitized civic rituals. But Miriam's grief was not a process, it was a presence. It was a silent vortex that drew all the light and warmth from the space around her. 33 years ago, an impossible promise had been whispered into her soul, the promise of a son who would change the world. She had guarded that promise, pondered it, and watched it bloom into the man now pinned to the pillar. Now she was living the fulfillment of a darker prophecy, whispered by an old mystic in the temple long ago, that a sword of sorrow would pierce her own soul. The cold metallic spike pinning her son's hand to the pillar was that sword, and she felt its phantom agony in her own heart with every ragged breath he took. Beside her stood Jonathan, younger, his face etched with a torment that was a mixture of grief, guilt, and a desperate protective loyalty. He was the keeper of the word, the one who had followed Jesus with a small, illicit data slate, meticulously recording the parables and teachings that the synod sought to erase. He had captured the light of the Sermon on the Mount, the warmth of the miracles, the radical truth of the Beatitudes. Now, he felt the crushing weight of his own helplessness. His words, his records, what were they now in the face of this brutal, overwhelming reality? He had fled during the arrest, a moment of fear that now burned in his gut like acid. He had returned to stand here, but all he could do was watch, a silent witness to a tragedy he could not stop. He placed a hand on Miriam's arm, not to comfort her, for what comfort could there be, but to anchor himself. Jesus saw them. He saw his mother's silent scream of a soul. He saw Jonathan's fierce, impotent love. In a city that had atomized the family unit, reducing it to a state-sanctioned biological function, he saw the last, resilient threads of a bond forged in love, not law. And in this most crucial moment of his divine mission, as he bore the weight of a broken cosmos, he paused to perform an act of profound, world-altering human love. He pushed up. The motion was a symphony of torture. The metal groaned, his sinews screamed. Warden Cassian flinched, instinctively anticipating a cry of pain. But the sound that came was different. It was a voice of deliberate, focused intention. His gaze locked with his mother's. He did not call her mother. To do so would have been to confine this moment to the personal, the familial. Instead, he used a title that was both archaic and universal, a word that stripped away her civic designation and restored her to her archetypal essence. Woman, he rasped, the word echoing with the weight of creation itself. Miriam's eyes, which had been lost in the abyss of her grief, snapped into focus. He was speaking to her. Behold, Jesus continued, his voice straining but clear, your son. His head turned slightly, a motion that must have felt like turning a grinding stone, indicating the young man beside her. Miriam looked at Jonathan, and for the first time she saw him not just as her son's devoted friend, but as something more. She saw the future. She saw the continuation. She saw the vessel into which her son was pouring his legacy. Jonathan was no longer just a boy. He was now a responsibility, a living testament. Then, Jesus' eyes found Jonathan's. The command that followed was not a suggestion. It was a sacred investiture, a charge given from a throne of pain. Behold your mother. In that instant, the universe reordered itself for Jonathan. The weight of his guilt was transmuted into the weight of a holy duty. He was no longer just the keeper of the word. He was now the guardian of the source. He was being entrusted with the heart from which the story began. He looked at Miriam, and she was no longer just his master's grieving mother. She was his own. His purpose, which had seemed to be dissolving into ash, was now forged anew, solid and clear. He squeezed her arm, and this time it was not for his own anchor, but for hers. A silent, unbreakable vow passed between them. From that moment on, they were a new kind of family, a unit bound not by biology, but by a shared love for the man on the pillar, a spiritual kinship that would become the blueprint for a new community, a subversive cell of love planted in the heart of a loveless city. From his elevated platform, High Elder Theron watched the exchange through a magnified lens. He saw only a moment of sentimental weakness. A dying man concerned with domestic arrangements. It was pathetic. It affirmed his belief that emotions were a flaw, a distraction from the grand logical march of history. He had won. The anachronistic concept of personal love was dying before his very eyes. But Warden Cassian saw something entirely different. He was a man of the state. He knew the state's provisions for the dependents of the condemned. They were to be reassimilated, their memories wiped, their former connections dissolved. It was efficient and clean. What he had just witnessed was the opposite. It was messy, personal, and profoundly powerful. A man at the epicenter of his own destruction was meticulously reweaving the social fabric around him. This wasn't weakness. It was a display of authority so fundamental it operated outside the state's entire framework. He looked at the two figures now clinging to each other, their shared grief giving them an impossible strength. He looked at the man on the pillar who had orchestrated it, and Cassian felt another crack appear in the cold armor around his soul. This was a love that built things, even in the face of total annihilation. It was a power he did not understand, and it frightened him more than any armed rebellion. The city's perpetual grey sky began to darken. It was not the natural descent of evening, nor the predictable dimming of the atmospheric regulators. This was something else. A profound, unnatural gloom seeped into the air, as if a great cosmic hand were slowly closing its fist around Ethelberg. The holographic advertisements on the distant spires flickered and died. The hum of the city's power grid, a sound so constant it was usually part of the silence, faltered and dropped in pitch, becoming a low, ominous drone. Panic, a rare and volatile commodity in the City of Order, began to ripple through the crowd on the Cinder Plateau. Their programmed composure cracked, replaced by nervous murmurs and fearful glances at the failing sky. The darkness was not merely an absence of light, it felt like a presence. It was a cold, heavy blanket that smothered sound and leached warmth from the air. It was the color of ultimate despair, a physical manifestation of a spiritual event of unimaginable magnitude. On his viewing platform, High Elder Theron stared at his data slate, his face pale with fury and confusion. "Report," he snarled into his comms. "What is the status of the atmospheric shell? Is this a solar flare? A power grid failure?" The panicked reply came back, laced with static. "Negative, High Elder. All systems report nominal function. The grid is stable. Atmospheric regulators are at 100%. We don't know what this is. The light is simply failing." Theron felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. This was a variable he had not and could not account for. For the man on the central pillar, the external darkness was a mere reflection of the cataclysm unfolding within him. The physical pain, which had been a white-hot nova, was now secondary. A new, infinitely more terrifying agony was ascending. He, the Word through whom all things were made, the one who had existed in a perfect, unbroken symphony of love with the Father since before time, was beginning to experience the unthinkable silence. The bond, the eternal current of communion that was the very essence of his being, was fraying. He was becoming the thing he had come to destroy. The accumulated weight of Ethelberg's cold logic, its calculated cruelties, its lovelessness, its fear the entirety of humanity's rebellion against its source was being poured into his spirit. He who was pure light was being infused with absolute darkness. He who was perfect love was being made the embodiment of separation. The cosmic justice that demanded a reckoning for a universe fractured by sin was now falling, with the force of 1,000 collapsing stars upon this single point of consciousness. He was being abandoned, not by a distant, angry deity, but by the very ground of his own existence. It was a spiritual black hole, a tearing of the fabric of reality itself. From the depths of this unimaginable abyss, a cry was born. It was not a thought, not a prayer, but a raw, primal scream of a soul being ripped from its source. He pushed himself up one last time, every muscle fiber shredding, his body a mere vessel for this cosmic agony. The cry that tore from his throat was not in the sterile, universal language of Ethelberg. It was in an ancient, earthy tongue from a forgotten time, a language of sand and stars, of poets and prophets. The Aramaic words ripped through the unnatural twilight, raw and terrifying. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. The sound was so filled with anguish that it struck the crowd like a physical blow. Those who had been mocking fell silent, their faces slack with a primal fear they did not understand. Warden Cassian felt the words bypass his ears and detonate directly in his soul. Even Kale, the cynical data thief on the neighboring pillar, ceased his groaning, his own pain momentarily forgotten in the face of this monumental despair. A member of the synod on the platform, a historian of ancient religions, recognized the phonetics. "It's an old dialect," he whispered to Theron, his voice trembling. "He is quoting from one of the forbidden texts, a psalm of the ancients. It means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Theron scoffed, a desperate attempt to reassert his intellectual control. He's delirious. His mind is collapsing. It's a sign of weakness, a final admission of his own failure. But Cassian, standing below, knew it was not weakness. Weakness is silent. Weakness surrenders. This was something else. This was the sound of a battle being fought on a plane of existence he could barely imagine. The why in the cry was not a question born of confusion. Jesus knew the plan. He had walked willingly into this darkness. The why was the horrifying, experiential reality of the moment. It was the Son, who had only ever known the face of the Father, now looking up and seeing nothing but the void. This was the true price. Not the spikes, not the energy lashes, not the public humiliation. The true cost of bridging the chasm between a broken humanity and its creator was this moment of absolute, soul-shattering dereliction. He was taking the full weight of the nothingness that Kale had espoused, the final data deletion that was the logical end of a world without God. And he was experiencing it so that Rorik, and all the Roriks to come, would never have to. The darkness that enveloped the plateau was the Father turning his face away, not from a lack of love for the Son, but out of an infinite love for the world he was redeeming. It was the moment divine justice and divine mercy collided, and the explosion was happening inside the man on the pillar. For Miriam and Jonathan, the cry was a sword that twisted in their hearts. They could not comprehend its theological depth, but they understood its human reality. They were hearing the sound of the person they loved most in the universe, experiencing a torment beyond all human conception. Miriam's knees finally buckled, and she sank to the ground, her silent grief finally breaking into a choked, heartbroken sob. Jonathan knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her, shielding her as if he could protect her from the echo of that terrible cry. The light of the world was experiencing the ultimate darkness, so that the citizens of Ethelberg, lost in their own grey twilight, might one day have a chance to see the dawn. And Warden Cassian, a man of order and law, stood frozen in the gloom, realizing that all the laws he had ever enforced were meaningless trifles compared to the terrible, beautiful law of sacrifice that was being written in blood and darkness before his very eyes. The unnatural darkness lingered, a heavy shroud upon the cinder plateau. The city of Ethelberg, a metropolis built on the illusion of complete control, was now at the mercy of a phenomenon it could not explain, let alone command. In this eerie twilight, time itself seemed to warp, stretching the minutes into agonizing eternities. For Jesus, pinned between the cold alloy of the pillar and the crushing weight of cosmic sin, the abandonment had passed its peak. The terrible silence from the Father was beginning to recede, replaced by a new emerging reality. The end was near. The mission was almost complete. In the wake of that soul-rending cry, a profound physical reality asserted itself with brutal intensity. His body, a marvel of human engineering, was shutting down. The scourging had opened countless pathways for fluid to escape. The constant strain against the spikes, the shallow, ragged breaths, the relentless exposure, it had all culminated in a catastrophic state of dehydration. His blood, thick and sluggish, struggled to carry life through his veins. His tongue, swollen and rough, felt like a piece of dry leather cleaving to the roof of his mouth. The thirst was not merely a discomfort. It was a consuming fire, an elemental torment that raged from the inside out. He who had once stood by a well in Samaria and spoken of a living water that would quench all thirst forever, was now consumed by the most basic of human needs. He, who the old text said had commanded the seas and drawn water from a rock, was now utterly dependent, utterly human. The words of the ancient psalm, the one he had cried out from in his moment of dereliction, continued to echo in his spirit. One line surfaced, not as a memory, but as a prophecy now breathing its last, demanding to be fulfilled. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth, you lay me in the dust of death. He knew everything was converging. Every ancient promise, every prophetic whisper was finding its final perfect fulfillment in these agonizing hours. The script of redemption, written before the foundation of the world, required this final, humble admission of need. With an effort that seemed to drain the last dregs of his physical strength, he pushed his weight onto the spikes one more time. His voice, when it came, was not a cry, but a single cracked syllable that seemed to carry the dryness of all the deserts of the world. I thirst. The two words, barely a whisper, sliced through the quiet tension of the plateau. It was a statement of such profound and simple humanity that it was, in its own way, as shocking as the cry of abandonment had been. For a moment, it humanized him to the crowd in a way his miracles never could. The God-man, the liberator, the prophet, was thirsty, just like them. Down below, the wardens shifted uneasily. This was not in their protocols. Their job was to oversee the execution, not to provide comfort. But the sound was so deeply pathetic, so utterly basic, that it moved something even in their hardened hearts. One of them, a young recruit named Lucius, looked at Warden Cassian, his eyes wide with a question. Cassian's mind was a battlefield. Elder Theron's orders had been to expedite the process. Showing any form of compassion was a direct contradiction of that silent command. Yet the sound of that thirst coming after the cry of anguish felt like a test. Not a test from the synod, but from something far older. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Lucius, grateful, hurried to a supply crate. The standard issue ration for wardens on long duty included a cheap, sour, winnie-thin, acidic liquid called Posca. It was more for cutting the dust in their throats than for pleasure. He found a flask, poured some of the liquid onto a coarse sponge attached to the end of a cleaning rod, and raised it towards the central pillar. High on the viewing platform, Theron watched this unfold with disgust. In subordination, he muttered to the aide beside him, "Make a note of that warden's designation. He will be disciplined." Compassion was a system error, an inefficiency that had to be purged. Jesus felt the damp sponge touch his lips. The sharp, vinegary taste was a shock to his system, a far cry from the cool, life-giving water his body craved. Yet he accepted it. This too was part of the story. Another ancient verse ignited in his mind. "For my thirst, they gave me vinegar to drink." Every detail was being woven together, every loose thread of prophecy tied off. But the thirst he felt was a chasm far deeper than his parched throat. It was the echo of a greater longing. It was the thirst of a creator for his lost creation, the thirst of a shepherd for his scattered sheep. It was the burning desire to see the mission through to its end, to bring the water of life to a world dying of thirst, even if it meant he himself had to be emptied to the last drop. His physical thirst was a symbol of humanity's deep spiritual dehydration, its desperate need for reconciliation with God, a need so profound that most, like the citizens of Ethelberg, didn't even know they had it. His acceptance of the sour wine was also an act of supreme humility. He who was the source of all things was now receiving a meager offering from the hands of his executioner. It was the final expression of the kenosis, the self-emptying, that had begun when he first took on human flesh. The small act of kindness, however, seemed to break a spell. Down in the crowd, a woman began to weep openly. A man near her, who had been shouting insults an hour before, now stood in silence, his head bowed, his face a mask of confusion. The simple human vulnerability of the man on the pillar had pierced their armor of programmed cynicism in a way his power never had. Warden Cassian watched it all. He saw the sour wine, the fulfillment of a prophecy he was only just beginning to understand. He saw the ripples of compassion spreading through the crowd. He saw the fury on Elder Theron's face, projected on a small monitor, and he understood. The thirst of the man on the pillar was not a sign of his defeat, but of his victory. It was a thirst for the very souls of the people watching him, a thirst to complete the work of salvation. The thirst was not just his need, it was his purpose. And in that moment, Cassian felt a deep, unfamiliar thirst of his own, thirst for the truth that was being unveiled, drop by agonizing drop, on the cinder plateau. The sour wine, a final bitter sacrament, did little to quench the fire in his throat, but it served a greater purpose. It was the last fulfilled detail, the final note in a long and sorrowful overture. Now, the symphony could reach its crescendo. A new strength, not born of the body but of the spirit, began to flood through Jesus. The haze of pain receded, replaced by a crystalline, victorious clarity. He was no longer just a man dying. He was a king ascending his throne, a high priest completing the ultimate sacrifice. He could feel the shift in the fabric of the cosmos. The immense debt of humanity's sin, a record of rebellion and brokenness so vast it was unpayable, had been transferred to his account. He had borne its full weight in the darkness, paid its ultimate price in the silence of his abandonment. And now, the transaction was complete. The city of Aethelberg was built on the concept of debt. Citizens incurred civic debts for minor infractions, information debts for unauthorized knowledge, and energy debts for excessive consumption. Every aspect of life was a transaction, and all accounts had to be balanced. The ultimate penalty, reserved for ideological bankruptcy, was the pillar of penantia final, public declaration that a debt was unpayable by the individual and was being settled by their erasure. From the depths of his being, Jesus prepared to make a declaration of his own. It was a cry that would shatter Aethelberg's entire economic and spiritual system. He drew in a breath, and this time it was not a ragged gasp for air, but a deep, resonant inhalation of triumph. He pushed himself up from the pillar, not with the strained agony of before, but with a surge of sovereign power that seemed to make the very metal of the structure hum. His eyes, no longer clouded with pain, blazed with a light that seemed to pierce the unnatural gloom. His voice, when it came, was not the whisper of a dying man. It was a roar of victory, a sound that carried the finality of a judge's gavel and the joy of a debt paid in full. It was a single word in the old Greek tongue, a language of precision and commerce, known to the educated elite of the city. Tetelestai. The word exploded from his lips and rolled across the cinder plateau. It was a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the viewing platform and vibrated in the very bones of the wardens. It meant far more than its simple translation. It was not just "it is finished," it was a seal of absolute completion. In the marketplaces of Aethelberg's lower levels, when a merchant received the final credit for a large shipment, they would stamp the bill of lading with that very word, tetelestai, paid in full. When an artist in the cultural sector put the final brushstroke on a masterwork, they would step back and whisper to themselves, tetelestai. It is complete. Nothing can be added or taken away. When a warden completed a long and arduous term of service, their discharge papers would bear the official seal, tetelestai. The duty is accomplished. The word was a declaration of total, perfect, and irreversible finality. The debt of sin, tetelestai, paid in full. The balance sheet of humanity, once hopelessly in the red, was now wiped clean, stamped with the blood of the guarantor. The prophetic scriptures, the long and winding story of God's redemptive plan, tetelestai, it is fulfilled. Every promise, from the first whispered hope in a lost garden to the detailed agonies described by the prophet Isaiah, had found its perfect resolution. The story was complete. The dominion of the forces of darkness, the fear and control peddled by the synods and therans of the world, tetelestai, it is defeated. The ancient enemy, the serpent who had whispered lies of rebellion, had struck the heel, but his own head was now crushed under the weight of this ultimate act of sacrificial love. In that single victorious cry, the entire religious and philosophical structure of Aethelberg was rendered obsolete. The system of works and merits, of civic duties and ritualistic purges, was revealed as a hollow sham. Access to God, to true life, was not something to be earned through conformity or ritual. It had been purchased, in full, by this one perfect sacrifice. At the very moment the word left his lips, a new sound ripped through the air, coming not from the plateau, but from the heart of the city itself. It was the screech of tearing metal and the explosive discharge of energy. A panicked message flooded Warden Cassian's comm unit. "Sir, we have a major structural failure at the High Temple. The veil, the great energy curtain separating the inner sanctum, it's been torn. From the top down, the power source is exposed." The High Temple, the seat of the Synod's power, had a holy of holies of its own. It was the central server core, a place of immense power and data, shielded by a shimmering, impenetrable energy veil that only the High Elder could pass through. Now that veil, the symbol of separation between the elite and the common, between the sacred and the profane, had been torn apart from the inside out. The way was now open. High Elder Theron heard the report and stared in horror. It was impossible. It was a catastrophic failure, a sacrilege against the very heart of their power. Warden Cassian looked from the frantic reports on his data slate to the figure on the pillar, who now hung limp, his head bowed, his triumphant cry still echoing in the silence. Cassian finally understood. This was no coincidence. The tearing of the temple veil was the physical exclamation point to that spiritual declaration. The old system was broken. The old way was finished. The wall of separation was down. For Jonathan, the word was a revelation. Tetelestai. His work as a scribe, a keeper of the words, was now given its ultimate context. He was not just recording the life of a great teacher, he was documenting the completion of the greatest work in history. For Miriam, the cry was both a sword and a balm. Her son's suffering was finished, the terrible task was done. Her grief was still a vast ocean. But now, on the distant horizon, she could see the first faint glimmer of a purpose that was beyond her understanding. For everyone on that plateau, believers and scoffers alike, the world had been irrevocably altered. The victorious cry of "it is finished" did not signal an end, but a new beginning. It was the sound of a prison door being blown off its hinges, a new and living way being opened for all. The work was done, the price was paid, the victory was won. The victorious echo of Tetelestai faded, leaving a silence on the cinder plateau that was deeper and more profound than the unnatural darkness. The battle was over. The cosmic transaction was complete. The weight of sin had been borne, the enemy disarmed, the veil torn, the way opened. All that remained was the final, gentle act of release. Jesus' body, the physical vessel that had endured so much, was now almost entirely spent. The surge of divine power that had fueled his triumphant cry now subsided, leaving him at the very precipice of death. But he was not slipping into unconsciousness. His mind remained a beacon of lucid, serene awareness. He was not a victim succumbing to his injuries. He was a sovereign willingly crossing a threshold. He felt the fragile, frayed connection to his father, which had been so brutally severed in the darkness, now fully restored. The silence of abandonment was replaced by a welcoming, loving presence that was more real and solid than the obsidian pillar he was pinned to. The communion was restored. The mission given to him in the timeless councils of eternity was fulfilled. Peace, a true and unshakable peace that surpassed all understanding, flooded his soul. It was time to go home. He returned to the language of his childhood, the simple, intimate words he had used in prayer since he was a boy. His final declaration would not be a king's decree or a prophet's proclamation, but a child's trusting whisper. He lifted his head one last time. The movement was slow, deliberate, devoid of the agonizing strain of before. It was an act of pure will, a final testament to his control over the life he was now choosing to lay down. His gaze was not directed at the crowd below or the failing sky above, but inward and upward, toward a reality unseen by any other. His voice, when he spoke, was not a cry of victory or a whisper of pain. It was quiet, calm, and filled with an absolute, untroubled trust. "Father," he breathed, and the name was a perfect circle, completing the arc that had begun with his first prayer of forgiveness. He had begun his ordeal by entrusting his enemies to the Father's care. He would end it by entrusting himself to that same care. "Into your hands," he continued, his voice steady, "I commit my spirit." The words were a quotation, drawn from an ancient psalm of trust, sung by his ancestors in times of great peril. But this was no mere recitation, it was the ultimate active surrender. The Greek word he used for commit was paratithemi, a banking term. It was the word a person would use when making a deposit, entrusting a valuable possession to a trusted guardian for safekeeping, fully expecting to receive it back again. He was not losing his life. He was depositing it in the safest place in the universe. He was fulfilling his own earlier declaration, a statement that had baffled the synod. No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. In a city obsessed with control, this was the final paradoxical act of supreme authority, the power to willingly and peacefully release control into the hands of a higher loving power. The hands of the Father were the same hands that had sculpted galaxies from dust, the same hands that had measured the oceans, the same hands that had held him and guided him his entire life. To die was not to fall into a void, but to fall into those hands. As the final syllable left his lips, he bowed his head and let go. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. It was over. But the way it ended was all wrong. There was no final, desperate struggle for breath, no convulsive agony. It was a peaceful, deliberate release, as gentle as a man falling asleep in his own bed. The liberator, the prophet, the man from Galilee, was dead. Warden Cassian stood frozen, his hand still resting on the hilt of his weapon. He had presided over hundreds of executions on the pillar. He knew what death looked like here. It was always ugly, a desperate, animalistic clawing for life until the very last moment. This was something else entirely. This was a departure, not a demise. He had witnessed a man take his last breath with more authority than High Elder Theron wielded in his highest council. The surrender was more powerful than any act of defiance. The cry of a woman's grief, sharp and pure, cut through the silence. It was Miriam. Jonathan held her, his own face buried in her shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. But even in their shared agony, the final words of Jesus resonated not as an ending, but as a promise. He had shown them not only how to live, but how to die with unshakable trust in the Father's hands. On the neighboring pillar, Rorik the Revolutionary, his face still serene with the promise of paradise, had quietly passed away moments before, his own final breaths a peaceful release inspired by the man he had come to trust. On the other side, Cale the Cynic watched the scene, his mind finally, utterly broken. The peaceful death, the voluntary surrender, it was the final piece of data that his worldview could not compute. It defied all logic, all reason, all of the bitter truths he had built his life upon. He began to weep, not tears of grief or repentance, but of sheer, unadulterated confusion. His entire reality had been dismantled. The supernatural darkness began to recede. A sliver of the grey artificial light pierced the gloom, illuminating the central pillar. It fell upon the still form of Jesus, peaceful in death, his work completed, his spirit safely deposited. And in that moment, the truth that had been cracking the armor of Warden Cassian's soul finally broke through. The evidence was overwhelming, the conclusion inescapable. He looked up at the figure on the pillar, and in a voice loud enough for his nearby men to hear, a voice filled with a terrible, world-altering awe, he made his official report, not to the synod, but to the universe itself. Truly, Warden Cassian declared, his voice shaking, this man was the Son of God. The gloom over the cinder plateau finally broke, not returning to the sterile grey of before, but dissolving into an unusually soft, late afternoon light, as if the very atmosphere of Ethelberg had been scrubbed clean. The death of Jesus was not an end, but a caesura, a sacred pause in the symphony of creation. In the aftermath, the 7 statements he had made from the Pillar of Penance began to resonate, no longer as isolated cries of agony or pronouncements of faith, but as a single, perfectly interwoven composition, a testament to a love that had journeyed into the heart of despair and emerged victorious. The arc of this symphony was breathtaking in its perfection. It began with the word Father, a prayer of radical forgiveness for his enemies, and it concluded with the same intimate name, Father, a prayer of absolute trust for himself. It was a perfect circle of reconciliation, starting with the mending of the horizontal relationship between humanity and ending with the restoration of the vertical relationship between humanity and God. Between these 2 anchor points, the full depth and breadth of divine love had been revealed. The promise to Rorik, the repentant revolutionary, was the symphony's soaring melody of grace, a powerful statement that salvation was immediate, unearned, and offered to any who would simply ask, even at the final moment. It was a radical defiance of Ethelberg's rigid system of merit and retribution, a promise that a person's worth was not defined by their ledger of deeds, but by their capacity for faith. The charge given to Miriam and Jonathan was the harmony, a quiet but profound counterpoint demonstrating that this divine cosmic love did not negate human connection but deepened and redefined it. In a city that sought to dissolve familial bonds into state-controlled functions, he had forged a new kind of family, a spiritual kinship built on shared love and mutual care. This act became the blueprint for the small, subversive community that would soon begin to grow like a resilient wildflower in the cracks of Ethelberg's sterile concrete. The cry of abandonment, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," was the symphony's discordant, terrifying movement, the descent into the abyss. It was the sound of the composer himself entering into the chaos to resolve it, bearing the full weight of the universe's brokenness to create a new harmony. It revealed the infinite cost of redemption, a price so high that it silenced all claims of self-sufficiency and laid bare the desperate need for a savior. The human whisper, "I thirst," was the vulnerable, relatable passage that grounded the entire piece. It reminded all who heard it that the hero of this epic was not a distant, untouchable deity, but one who had fully inhabited the human condition, experiencing its limitations, its pains, and its needs. His physical thirst became a poignant symbol of his spiritual thirst for the salvation of every soul in the thirsty, barren landscape of Ethelberg. The triumphant roar of Tetelestai was the finale's explosive crescendo. It was the declaration that the work was not just attempted, but perfectly and eternally accomplished. It was the sound of chains breaking, prison doors flying open, and a debt being stamped, paid in full for all of humanity. It rendered the entire sacrificial system of the Synod, with all its rituals and power structures, utterly bankrupt. And the final peaceful surrender, Father, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," was the symphony's closing note, fading into a perfect, hopeful silence. It was the ultimate lesson in trust, a demonstration that the final enemy, death itself, had been transformed from a terrifying void into a gentle homecoming. These 7 statements, born in blood and agony, now echoed in the hearts of those who had witnessed them. For Jonathan, they became the organizing principle of his recorded words, the lens through which the entire life and ministry of Jesus would now be understood. For Miriam, they were the 7 swords that had pierced her heart, but which would in time become the 7 pillars of her enduring faith. For Warden Cassian, they were a catalyst for a revolution within his own soul. He returned to his barracks not as a servant of the state, but as a man haunted by a new truth. The words dismantled his world of cold logic and blind obedience, forcing him to confront a reality governed by love, sacrifice, and grace. His journey from that day forward would be a difficult, dangerous path toward the God he had met at the foot of a pillar of penance. Even for High Elder Theron, secure in his tower, the events of the day left an indelible mark. Though he would publicly dismiss it all as a tragic anomaly, a seed of doubt had been planted. He had witnessed a power that his systems could not control, a narrative that his propaganda could not silence. The city had executed a man, but in doing so, had unleashed an idea more powerful and transformative than any army or government. The legacy of the 7 words began to spread, not through official broadcasts, but through whispers in the underlevels, through stories shared in secret gatherings, through the quiet, transformed life of a Roman warden and the unwavering faith of a small new family. They became a source of strength for the persecuted, a beacon of hope for the lost, and a challenge to the powerful. As we reflect on this symphony composed on a cross of pain, we are invited not merely to be spectators, but to let the music enter our own lives. Each word calls for a response. To forgive as we have been forgiven, to hope when we feel unworthy, to care for one another as family, to trust in the darkness, to acknowledge our needs, to live in the victory that has been won for us, and to face our own end with the same peaceful surrender. The 7 words from the pillar remain a timeless, transformative score, reminding all of humanity that in the darkest moment of history shone the brightest and most beautiful light of divine love, and its echo continues to change the world.